Knew the scent of the city's forgotten, knew the scent of the city's forgotten places better than she knew the scent of sun-warmed grass. It was a mix of wet earth, decay, and the sharp, metallic tang of runoff from the forges high above in the citadel. This was her world. The underbelly, the city's gut. A maze of sewer tunnels and maintenance corridors where sunlight was a myth. She was an omega, a stray, a ghost who kept the filth flowing away from the high-born wolves who walked in the light. Her hands were raw, her nails permanently rimmed with grime, and her back ached with a weariness that felt older than her 19 years. Worthless. The word had been etched into her soul by the orphanage matron, by the sneers of the other servants, by a world that had no place for a lone wolf with no pack and no name worth remembering. Her existence was a rhythm of scraping moss from grates, clearing blockages, and staying invisible. It was during one of these monotonous, soul-crushing shifts that she heard it. A sound that did not belong in the echoing dark. It was a whimper, thin, weak, and terrified. Ilara froze, her scraping tool held tight in her hand. Nothing alive was supposed to be down here, save for the rats and the blind things that swam in the deep channels. The sound came again, a piteous cry that snagged on something in her hollow chest. She followed it, her boots splashing through shallow, murky water, deeper into a section of the tunnels that was rarely used. The whimper led her to a narrow drainage pipe, half choked with debris. Wedged inside, shivering violently, was a wolf pup. It was small, its fur a matted mess of silver and black, caked with mud. One of its back legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its dark, terrified eyes glowed faintly in the gloom of her lantern light. Compassion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Kindness was a weakness that got you trampled. She knew this. But as the pup whimpered again, a sound of pure, helpless pain, the cold walls she had built around her heart cracked. She saw her own reflection in its trembling form, small, alone, and hurt in a world too big and too cruel. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Slowly, carefully, she began to clear the debris from around the pipe. The pup flinched, letting out a weak growl that was more fear than threat. Ilara worked with a patience born of a lifetime of thankless tasks. She used her bare hands to pull away the filth, ignoring the sharp sting of a broken piece of pottery that sliced her palm. Blood welled, dripping into the murky water, but she didn't stop. Finally, she had cleared enough space to gently ease the small body out. The pup was lighter than she expected, a fragile weight of bone and fear. She cradled it against her chest, tucking it inside her worn tunic for warmth. Its little body trembled against hers, a rapid, desperate heartbeat she could feel against her own ribs. As she held it, her fingers brushed against something hard around its neck, a collar. It wasn't leather, but finely wrought silver, with a single, small charm attached, a carved wolf howling at a crescent moon. This was no stray. This pup belonged to someone important. Someone with the kind of wealth that could afford silver for a pup's collar. A cold dread, sharper than the tunnel's chill, washed over her. A pup like this wasn't just lost. It was a liability. Being found with it could be seen as theft. She should put it back. Leave it. Forget she ever saw it. But it whimpered again, a soft, trusting sound this time, and nuzzled its head against her collarbone. It was warm. The first truly warm thing she had felt in years. She couldn't leave it. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her undertunic and, with clumsy, gentle fingers, fashioned a crude splint for the pup's broken leg. It yelped once, a sharp cry of pain, and she murmured soft nonsense until it quieted, licking at the bloody cut on her hand. The decision was made. It wasn't a choice. Not really. It was an impulse, a foolish, reckless flicker of defiance against a life that had demanded nothing but her silent submission. She would take it to the surface. She would find who it belonged to. Clutching the pup to her chest, she turned her back on the familiar darkness and began the long climb towards the light, towards a world that had never wanted her. The rain was a cold, relentless sheet, washing the grime of the city into the very drain she had just left. Alara emerged into a narrow alley, blinking as the gray daylight assaulted her eyes. The world above was just as bleak as the one below, only louder. The sounds of cartwheels on cobblestone, of merchants shouting, of the ever-present clang of the citadel's forges, filled the air. She pulled her thin cloak tighter, trying to shield the pup from the downpour. People hurried past, their faces grim, their shoulders hunched against the weather. No one gave her a second glance. She was part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the moss-stained walls and overflowing gutters. The citadel loomed at the city's heart, a jagged crown of black stone that clawed at the sky. It was a place of power, of legends, the home of the Alpha King. A man spoken of only in whispers, a king of immense power and bottomless sorrow. She had never seen its gates up close before. They were a monument of iron and unforgiving stone, flanked by guards in polished steel armor that shed the rain like a wolf's pelt. Her courage, a small, fragile thing, threatened to desert her. These men were alphas, warriors. She was nothing. Less than nothing. They would laugh at her. They would accuse her of stealing the pup and throw her in the dungeons to rot. Her feet faltered on the slick stones. Maybe she should just turn back, find a quiet place for the pup, try to nurse it herself. But the silver collar felt heavy with unspoken consequence. This was not a creature she could hide. Taking a breath that felt thin and useless in her lungs, she forced herself forward. She approached the guards, keeping her eyes downcast, her body language a carefully constructed apology for her own existence. "What do you want, sewer rat?" One of them sneered, his gaze sweeping over her filthy clothes with open disgust. I found something," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the drumming of the rain. "A pup. It has this collar. I think it might belong to someone important." She tried to show them the silver charm, but the pup, startled by the harsh voice, began to whine, a high, piercing sound of distress. The second guard laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Get lost. The citadel doesn't misplace its property, and it certainly doesn't send the likes of you to recover it. Be gone before I give you a matching limp to that mutt's." Tears of humiliation and fear pricked at her eyes. This was a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. She turned to leave, her shoulders slumping in defeat. But the pup's whining escalated into a desperate, frantic cry. It was a sound that seemed to cut through the noise of the rain and the city, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. And then, everything changed. A deep, resonant clang echoed as the massive iron gates began to swing inward. Not with the grinding slowness of guards pulling levers, but with a smooth, silent power that was utterly unnatural. The guards snapped to attention, their mockery wiped from their faces and replaced with stark terror. A figure emerged from the shadows of the gatehouse, stepping out into the rain. He was huge, a mountain of a man clad in black leather and dark fur that seemed to drink the gray light. The rain did not seem to touch him, evaporating into mist an inch from his skin. His presence was a physical force, a weight that pressed down on the air, silencing the world. His face was harsh, carved from granite and sorrow, with a jaw that could have been forged in the mountain's heart. And his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, chilling silver gray that held the cold of centuries. It was him, the Alpha King, Kaelin. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of pure, primal fear. She had never seen him, but every wolf in the kingdom knew the stories. The warrior king who had single-handedly ended the southern wars, the grieving ruler who had lost his mate and son in a tragic fire 2 centuries ago. The alpha whose power was so immense it was said he could freeze a man's blood with a single glance. His gaze swept past the terrified guards, past the rain-slicked courtyard, and landed on her. It was like being pinned by a glacier. The world narrowed to just his eyes and the small, trembling creature in her arms. He took a step towards her, then another. He moved with a predator's grace that was terrifying in a being of his size. The guards did not move. No one breathed. He stopped a few feet away, his sheer height forcing her to crane her neck back. He was close enough now that she could smell him, the scent of pine after a frost, of cold stone, and something else, something ancient and wild and deeply masculine. It was overwhelming. His silver eyes were not on her face, but on the pup. A flicker of something, not emotion, but the ghost of one, passed through their frozen depths. He looked at the crude splint on its leg, then at the bloody, half-healed cut on her hand. His voice, when he spoke, was not the thunder she expected. It was deep, yes, but quiet. A low rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet. You found him. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, imbued with an authority that left no room for argument. Alara could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. The pup, as if sensing a familiar presence, let out a soft whimper and tried to squirm towards him. Kaelin's gaze finally lifted to her face. He looked at her, truly looked, and she felt stripped bare. He saw the grime, the poverty, the worthlessness she carried like a second skin. But his expression didn't hold the disgust she expected. It held nothing. A vast empty stillness. He extended a hand, not to her, but to the pup. His fingers, long and scarred, gently stroked the pup's head. A tremor went through the tiny body, but it was one of comfort, not fear. Come, he said, the single word an undeniable command. He turned and walked back towards the gates, not looking back to see if she followed. He didn't need to. The world itself seemed to bend to his will. The guards stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Alara stood frozen for a moment, rain dripping from her hair, the king's command echoing in the sudden silence. Then, on legs that felt like trembling stilts, she followed the Alpha King into the heart of the citadel. The warmth inside the citadel was a shock to her system. It was a living heat, radiating from massive hearths that roared with clean burning logs. The air smelled of beeswax, dried herbs, and roasted meat. After a life of damp chill, it was so overwhelming it made her dizzy. Servants and courtiers flattened themselves against the stone walls as the king strode through the halls, his heavy boots making no sound on the polished floors. Alara followed in his wake, a filthy, dripping shadow clutching a wounded pup. She was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers that erupted behind them like the rustling of dry leaves. She had never felt more out of place, a piece of gutter trash washed into a palace. Kaelin led her not to a grand hall or a throne room, but up a winding staircase to a suite of private chambers. The rooms were vast, furnished with dark, heavy wood and rich tapestries, yet they felt empty. A profound loneliness clung to the air, a chill that even the roaring fires couldn't quite banish. He gestured to a low table near the hearth. Put him down. Alara did as she was told, gently placing the pup on a soft fur rug. The pup immediately tried to crawl towards the king, dragging its splinted leg. Kaelin knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid for such a large man, and ran a hand over the pup's back. The leg? He asked, his silver eyes flicking to her. It was twisted. Broken, I think, she whispered. I did what I could. He examined her crude handiwork, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment she thought he was angry, that she had done it wrong. He then looked at her hand, where the cut from the pottery was still oozing sluggishly. Without a word, he rose and left the room. Ilara stood awkwardly, not knowing what to do. Should she leave? Was she dismissed? The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the pup's soft whimpers. He returned a moment later with a healer, an older woman with kind eyes and capable hands. The king spoke to her in a low voice, and the healer immediately knelt by the pup, her hands glowing with a soft green light as she began to mend the broken bone. Kalen then turned to Ilara. He held out a small ceramic pot and a clean linen cloth. "Your hand," he said. It was an order. Trembling, she held out her hand. He took it. His touch was not what she expected. For all his coldness, his fingers were warm. The contrast was startling. He was so large, his hand completely engulfing hers, yet his touch was impossibly gentle. He carefully cleaned the wound and applied the salve from the pot. It soothed the sting instantly. His thumb brushed against her pulse point, and a strange jolt went through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, the frozen stillness in their depths wavered. Something shifted, like the crack of ice on a winter lake. Then it was gone, the mask of cold indifference slamming back into place. He released her hand as if burned. "A room will be prepared for you," he said, his voice flat, formal. "You will serve in the upper citadel, a reward for returning Fen." Fen. The pup had a name. "You don't have to, Your Majesty," she said, finding her voice. "I didn't do it for a reward." "Nevertheless," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you will remain here." He was erecting a wall between them, a formal arrangement of servant and master. This was a transaction, nothing more. But the way he had looked at her, the way his thumb had lingered on her wrist, it felt like something else entirely. Over the next few days, Ilara's life was turned upside down. She was given a small but clean room, clothes that weren't threadbare, and food that was warm and plentiful. It was more luxury than she had ever known, yet it felt like a gilded cage. The other servants treated her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She was the sewer rat the king himself had brought into the citadel. No one knew what to make of her. Kalen kept his distance. She would see him in the halls, a towering, silent presence, and he would look right through her. The formal boundary was firmly in place. And yet, he would appear late at night in the kitchens, claiming he wanted a glass of water while she was scrubbing pots. He wouldn't speak to her, but he would stand there, watching, his presence filling the vast empty room. He assigned her to care for Fen. The pup's leg was healing quickly under the healer's care, and he was a bundle of playful energy. It was a transparent excuse to see her. He would come to her room to check on the pup, his visits starting as brief, formal inquiries that slowly stretched into long silences where they would both just watch the pup play by the fire. During one of these visits, he spoke. "He was a gift for my son," he said, his voice low and rough, his eyes fixed on the flames. "The last thing I ever gave him." Ilara's heart ached for him. The stories were true. The grief clung to him like a shroud, a permanent winter in his soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her then, and the mask was gone. For a moment, she saw the raw, 200-year-old agony beneath. She saw a man utterly, completely alone. "He would have liked you," Kalen said, the admission sounding like it was torn from him. Intimacy was creeping in through the cracks of their arrangement. She was beginning to see past the cold king to the broken man. And he, she suspected, was beginning to see past the gutter filth to the person underneath. Not everyone approved of this fragile, unspoken connection. Lord Valyrius, the king's chief advisor, was a tall, severe man with eyes as sharp and cold as chips of obsidian. He had been at the king's side for decades, a pillar of stability since the great tragedy. He watched Ilara with unconcealed contempt. "You are a distraction the king cannot afford," Valyrius told her one day, cornering her in a deserted corridor. His voice was soft, silken, but held the menace of a coiled snake. "His grief is the bedrock of his power. It keeps him focused, sharp. Do not mistake a moment's curiosity for favor. You are a novelty, nothing more. A stray, he pitied. Know your place." His words were meant to wound, to remind her of her worthlessness, and they did. The old self-doubt came rushing back. Valerius was right. What was she thinking? That the most powerful man in the world could ever see her as anything more than a servant? The moments of connection were just figments of her hopeful imagination. But then, later that evening, Kaelin found her in the library, where she had been tasked with dusting the ancient tomes. He didn't say a word. He simply took a book from a high shelf and sat in a chair near where she was working. He didn't read it. He just sat there, his presence a quiet, solid shield against the shadows. The boundary was eroding, and Ilara, against all her better judgment, was beginning to hope. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling, and she had no idea that her small budding hope was about to place her in the path of a danger far older and more treacherous than she could ever imagine. The change in the king was subtle, but to Lord Valyrius, it was as loud as a thunderclap. A flicker of light in the frozen expanse of Kaelin's eyes, a softening around his mouth that was almost, but not quite, a smile when he watched the sewer girl with his dead son's pup. It was a thaw, and a thaw was a threat to the carefully constructed glacier of power Valyrius had built around the throne. For 2 centuries, Valyrius had been the true ruler of the kingdom. He had managed the council, directed policy, and whispered in the ear of a king hollowed out by grief. A king who was numb, predictable, and malleable. This girl, this nothing, with her quiet resilience and honest eyes, was a danger. She was waking Kaelin up. The advisor knew he had to act. He had to sever this burgeoning connection, remind the king of the pain of loss, and drive him back into the cold, familiar darkness where he was easily controlled. The attack was insidious, a masterstroke of political theater. It began with whispers. Rumors that the girl from the sewers was not as simple as she seemed. That she practiced hedge magic. That her sudden appearance was too convenient. Then came the incident. One morning, the king's personal attendant collapsed in the hallway, his face blue, his body convulsing. The healers were summoned, and they found traces of nightshade bloom in his system, a rare, potent poison that grew only in the citadel's most protected greenhouses. The attendant survived, but the seed of fear had been planted. There was a poisoner in the citadel. Valyrius made his move. He produced a witness, a young kitchen maid, who, with downcast eyes and a trembling voice, swore she had seen Ilara near the greenhouses late the night before. The maid's family had recently been gifted a small plot of land by an anonymous benefactor. Ilara was horrified. "I was cleaning the west wing," she insisted. "I was never near the greenhouses." But no one had seen her. She always chose the most deserted corridors, the most forgotten tasks. Her lifetime of making herself invisible was now being used as a weapon against her. The final piece of Valyrius's trap snapped shut when a search of her meager room revealed a small pouch hidden beneath her mattress. Inside were dried petals of nightshade bloom. She stared at the pouch in the guard's hand, her blood turning to ice. She had never seen it before in her life. It was a lie, a fabrication. But the evidence was damning. The whispers became shouts. The suspicion became certainty. She was brought before the king in the throne room. It was not the vast public hall, but a smaller, more intimate chamber used for private council. Valyrius stood at the king's right hand, his face a mask of solemn concern. The members of the inner council lined the walls, their faces grim and accusatory. Kaelin sat on the carved stone throne, not as a king, but as a man carved from ice. The warmth she had begun to see in him was gone, replaced by a winter more profound and terrifying than she had ever witnessed. His silver eyes were chips of flint, hard and cold. "You stand accused of attempted regicide," Valyrius announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "The evidence is clear." "I didn't do it," Alara said, her voice shaking but firm. She looked directly at Kaelin, pleading with her eyes. "Your Majesty, I would never. You have to believe me." Kaelin's face was unreadable. He was torn. Every piece of logic, every bit of evidence Valyrius presented pointed to her guilt. It was a familiar pattern. Betrayal, loss, a knife in the dark. The old wound, the one left by the fire that took his family, was ripped open. The pain was a cold, familiar poison in his veins. To trust her felt like a fool's errand. To trust was to invite devastation. "Why were you near the greenhouses?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I wasn't," she insisted, despair clawing at her throat. "Someone is lying." "The kitchen maid has no reason to lie," Valyrius interjected smoothly. "Whereas you, an omega of no standing, suddenly elevated. Perhaps the favor you were shown was not enough. Perhaps you wanted more." The accusation hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Alara felt the world shrinking, the walls closing in. She was trapped. No one would believe her. She was the sewer rat, the outsider. She looked at Kaelin, at the man who had shown her the first real kindness of her life, the man whose hidden pain mirrored her own loneliness. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between the cold evidence and the fragile nascent trust that had grown between them. He was being forced to choose, and she could see the choice was tearing him apart. This was the threat, not just to her life, but to the flicker of warmth she had ignited in him. Valyrius wasn't just trying to kill her. He was trying to kill the hope that was beginning to heal the king. The air in the throne room was thick with impending judgment. Alara's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Every face was a mask of suspicion, every shadow a lurking threat. Only Kaelin's face showed the deep, agonizing conflict that mirrored the turmoil in her own soul. "Speak the truth," Kaelin commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the stone floor. His eyes were locked on hers, a tempest of silver and gray. He was giving her one last chance to break through the wall of evidence Valyrius had so perfectly constructed. "I am," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I found a home here. For the first time in my life, I wasn't cold. Why would I destroy that? Why would I harm the one person who showed me?" She trailed off, unable to say the word. Kindness. It felt too small for what he had given her, yet too large to speak aloud in this room of wolves. Her raw honesty struck a chord. Kaelin's jaw tightened. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, a hairline crack in his icy composure. He was starting to believe her. Valyrius saw it. He saw his control slipping, the king leaning towards the girl's heartfelt plea over his carefully laid evidence. He knew he had to force the king's hand, to make the situation so dire that emotion would be extinguished by necessity. "A touching performance," Valyrius said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "But the facts remain. She is a danger." He took a step forward, his hand going to his chest. "My king, you must see reason. This sentimentality is a weakness she has exploited. A weakness that—" His words cut off in a choked gasp. He swayed on his feet, his face suddenly pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He pressed a hand to his heart, his breath coming in ragged pants. The poison, not just the attendant. She must have found a way. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. He had poisoned himself with a small, non-lethal dose to make it look as though Alara's plot was broader and more immediate than they had imagined. to frame her for an attack happening right now. Chaos erupted. Guards surged forward. The council members cried out in alarm. But it was all a distraction. In the confusion, as all eyes were on him, Valyrius lunged. Not with the weakness of a poisoned man, but with the explosive speed of a predator. He bypassed the guards, his target singular. Kaelin. From within his robes, Valyrius produced a thin black blade, its edge weeping a viscous, dark fluid. It was not a weapon for a fight, it was an assassin's tool. "Eat, she has made you weak, my king!" Valyrius snarled, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. "I did what was necessary to protect this kingdom then, and I will do it now." The words "then and now" struck Kaelin with the force of a physical blow. The fire, the accident that had taken his family. Valyrius had been there. He had been the one to pull the king from the flames. The hero who had set the fire. The realization dawned in Kaelin's eyes, a universe of horror and betrayal. But it was too late. The blade was too fast. Kaelin had time to block, but not perfectly. The dagger sliced across his forearm, a shallow cut. But it was enough. The Alpha King roared, a sound of pure, untamed rage, and backhanded Valyrius across the room. The advisor crashed into the stone wall with enough force to shatter bone. Guards were on him instantly, pinning him down. But the damage was done. Kaelin looked down at his arm. Where the blade had touched him, a network of black veins was spreading with terrifying speed, like frost creeping across a winter pane. A deadly, unnatural cold emanated from the wound, a chill that had nothing to do with his own internal winter. He staggered, a hand going to the throne for support. "Valyrius," he breathed, the name a curse. "The serpent's kiss," a healer whispered from the doorway, her face ashen. "There is no cure." The black frost spread up Kaelin's arm, reaching his shoulder, his chest. His breath hitched. The immense power that usually surrounded him flickered and dimmed. He fell to one knee, his great body trembling. The cold was consuming him from the inside out. He was dying. The world dissolved into a nightmare of shouts and panicked movements. Guards dragged the snarling, defeated Valyrius from the room. Healers rushed forward, their faces etched with despair. Alara saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to a single point. Kaelin, on his knees, the life visibly draining from him. The black frost was covering his chest now, a creeping plague of enchanted ice. His skin was turning gray, his lips blue. The vibrant, terrifying life force that had defined him was guttering like a candle in a gale. "Get back," one of the healers commanded, pushing her away. "You have done enough." But Alara didn't hear him. She pushed past them, her heart a frantic, wild thing in her chest. This couldn't be happening. Not him. He had just started to live again. She had seen it. She had felt it. She fell to her knees in front of him. He looked up, his silver eyes clouded with pain, the light in them fading. He saw her, and a flicker of something. Regret, apology, a desperate, unspoken farewell passed between them. "No," she whispered. The word was not a plea. It was a refusal, a declaration of war against fate, against poison, against death itself. She refused to let him go. Ignoring the healer's protests, she placed her hands on his chest, directly over the creeping black ice. The cold was absolute, a void that stole the warmth from her skin, sinking deep into her bones. It was the cold of the grave. She closed her eyes and focused. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she had to do something. She thought of the small spark of warmth he had ignited in her own frozen life, the gentleness in his touch when he cleaned her hand, the quiet companionship in the library, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She gathered all of that warmth, all of her desperate, burgeoning love for this broken, beautiful man, and she pushed. Something inside her answered, A heat bloomed in the center of her chest, a dormant, sleeping sun. It was a power she never knew she possessed, a core of pure life that had been buried under years of worthlessness and neglect. It surged through her veins, a torrent of liquid gold, hot and fierce. It rushed down her arms and into her hands. The moment her power touched the poison, there was a silent explosion of energy. A brilliant golden light erupted from her palms, so bright it forced everyone in the room to shield their eyes. The light was not fire. It was life itself. It was the warmth of the first spring day, the heat of a beating heart, the pure, undiluted essence of healing. It hurt. The power was too much, a river of fire carving new pathways through her body. It felt like it was burning her from the inside out, turning her veins to molten gold. A scream was torn from her throat, a sound of agony and defiance. But she didn't stop. She pushed harder, pouring every ounce of her being, every drop of this newfound energy into him. The golden light warred with the black frost, a battle of life against death playing out on the king's chest. The frost hissed and recoiled, melting away like snow in a forge. She could feel his life force, faint and flickering, and she wrapped her own power around it, shielding it, nurturing it, commanding it to burn brighter. The light grew, engulfing them both, filling the entire throne room with a blinding, divine radiance. It was a raw, untamed force of creation, a power that could mend the world or shatter it. In that moment, Alara was no longer a servant, no longer an omega, no longer worthless. She was a conduit of life, and she would not be denied. The torrent of golden light held for an eternity, then receded, flowing back into Alara as quickly as it had erupted. The sudden absence of its burning power left her feeling scoured out, hollowed. The throne room plunged back into the dim torchlight, the silence broken only by her own ragged gasps. She collapsed forward, her strength utterly spent, her head resting on Kaelin's chest. Her hands were numb, her vision swimming with black spots. She had given everything. She didn't know if it was enough. Then she felt it. Beneath her ear, steady and strong, a heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. Slowly she lifted her head. The black frost was gone. All of it. Kaelin's skin had regained its color. His breathing was deep and even. The wound on his arm was nothing more than a thin white scar, already healed. He was weak, exhausted, but he was alive. He opened his eyes. The silver gray was no longer clouded with pain or cold. It was clear, sharp, and filled with an emotion she had never seen there before. Awe. He looked at her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. He saw not the grime or the rags she used to wear, but the fierce, brilliant soul that burned within. He reached up, his hand surprisingly steady, and cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the path of a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. "It was always you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't a thank you. It was a recognition. A statement of a truth his soul had known from the moment he saw her at his gates, but his grieving mind had refused to accept. Her warmth wasn't just kindness. It was life, the perfect, destined counter to his centuries of cold. The council, the guards, the healers, they all stared in stunned silence. They had just witnessed an impossibility. The sewer rat, the accused poisoner, had saved their king with a power none of them had ever seen. Kaelin's gaze swept over them, and for the first time since the fire, it held the full, undeniable authority of the Alpha King, tempered now not by grief, but by a fierce, protective love. "She is my mate," he declared, his voice ringing with power that left no room for question or dissent. "Your future queen." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a possessive gentleness that made her bones ache with a feeling she finally recognized as belonging. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were the air he needed to breathe. "I was so cold for so long," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "I had forgotten what the sun felt like." Tears streamed down her face now, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a joy so profound it was painful. The years of being worthless, of being invisible and unloved, washed away in the circle of his arms. The deep, aching loneliness that had been her constant companion was gone. She wasn't just a servant. She wasn't just a healer. She was his, and he was hers. She clung to him, her strength slowly returning, the empty, hollow feeling inside her beginning to fill with the warmth of his presence. She had saved him from Valyrius's poison, but he had saved her from a lifetime of despair. They had rescued each other. In the silent, awestruck throne room, surrounded by the wreckage of a traitor's plot, a new world was being born. A world with a queen, a world with hope, a world where the Alpha King's heart was finally, after 200 years, beginning to thaw. 3 months later, the citadel was a different place. The oppressive pall of grief that had clung to the stones for 2 centuries had lifted, replaced by a tentative warmth that grew stronger each day. Laughter, a sound long absent from the grim halls, could sometimes be heard. The servants no longer walked with their heads bowed in perpetual mourning, but with a flicker of hope in their eyes. Ilara, their Alpha Queen, was the source of it all. Her presence had brought life back to the stone and the people within it. She moved through the citadel not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the quiet grace and kindness that was her nature. She spoke to the kitchen staff, learned the names of the guards' children, and spent time in the infirmary, where her very touch seemed to speed the healing of the sick and injured. She was loved. Lord Valyrius was a ghost, a name spoken only in whispers. He was imprisoned in the deepest cell of the citadel's dungeons, a place so far beneath the earth that not even rats dared to venture there. He was stripped of his name, his power, his very identity. He would live out the rest of his long life in cold, silent darkness, a fitting end for a man who had dealt in shadows and lies. Ilara stood on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens. The first snow of winter had fallen overnight, blanketing the world in a pristine layer of white. It was quiet, peaceful. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. "You are thinking too loudly," Kalen rumbled, his voice a warm vibration against her back. She leaned into his embrace, her hands covering his. "I was just thinking. I used to hate the cold. And now?" "Now," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "It just makes the warmth feel better." He smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his silver eyes and transformed his harsh features into something breathtakingly handsome. It was a sight that still made her heart skip a beat. His eyes, once the color of a winter storm, were now the color of silver warmed by a hearth fire. He looked down at her hands. Faint, silvery scars, like lightning trapped under the skin, traced the paths where her power had surged. They were a permanent reminder of the day she had saved him. He lifted one of her hands to his lips and kissed the scars. "Does it ever hurt?" he asked, his voice soft. She met his gaze, her heart overflowing with a love so vast it felt as though it could heal the whole world. She thought of the cold tunnels, the gnawing hunger, the soul-deep loneliness. She thought of the girl who believed she was worthless. That girl was a stranger to her now. "Not anymore," she whispered. A familiar yapping sound drew their attention. Fen, no longer a tiny pup but a lanky, half-grown wolf, bounded onto the balcony, a leather ball in his mouth. He dropped it at Kalen's feet, his tail wagging furiously, his dark eyes bright with mischief. Kalen chuckled and bent to pick up the ball. He is a menace, just like his namesake would have been. He spoke of his son now without the crushing weight of grief, but with a gentle, bittersweet fondness. Ilara's love had not erased his past, but it had allowed him to heal from it. He tossed the ball into the snow-covered garden, and Fen launched himself after it with joyous abandon. They watched him play, two figures standing close together against the winter chill, a perfect picture of peace. Valyrius said my grief was the bedrock of my power, Kaelin said quietly, his eyes on the wolf pup. He was wrong. It was the bedrock of his. My power comes from this. He placed a hand over her heart. From you. She knew he was right. Their bond, the one forged in darkness and desperation, was now the foundation of the kingdom's strength. His immense alpha power, once cold and destructive, was now tempered and focused by her life-giving warmth. Together, they were whole. The future was not without its challenges. There were neighboring kingdoms to treat with, a council to rebuild, and the long, slow work of healing a land that had been shrouded in sorrow for too long. But for the first time, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. Kaelin pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both gentle and possessive, a promise of forever. The snow fell softly around them, blanketing their new world in silence and peace. The king who had been lost to winter had finally found his son, and the girl from the sewer, who had only ever known darkness, had finally found her home in the light.